We often glance at countries on a map, maybe form a vague impression.
Yeah.
But when you look closer at a place like Bosnia and Herzegovina, you find this, well, deeply intricate and often surprising mix of economic and political stuff going on.
Absolutely. And that's really the heart of what we're digging into today. We're using this comprehensive report, Contemporary Challenges of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as our guide.
Right.
It pulls together some really vital perspectives from political science, economics, sociology, gives us a much clearer picture.
Okay, so our goal isn't just, a quick summary. We're really trying to get into the key challenges Bosnia and Herzegovina is facing right now.
Yeah.
We're talking about its administrative system, which sounds complex, the real state of its economy, what's happening with foreign investment.
The informal economy, too, the gray economy, which is huge but often hidden.
Exactly. And its place in the global political scene and, well, the big one, corruption.
And it's so important to see how these aren't just separate boxes. They're all tangled up, influencing where the country's headed.
Right.
So whether you're focused on the Western Balkans or maybe just interested in how countries transition after conflict, understanding these dynamics in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it offers some really valuable insights, I think.
Definitely. So let's start where the report points first, this major financial pressure point.
Yeah.
The administrative system. Sounds like quite a burden.
Yeah, what jumps out immediately is just how complex the government structure is. You've got the state level,
Okay.
then the two main entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska.
Right, the two entities.
And then inside the Federation, you've got cantons, plus the Brčko district, which is kind of its own thing.
Wow.
And this whole setup report makes clear it's a direct result of the Dayton Accords. It's based on this principle of ethno-territorial division.
Meaning?
Basically, it's designed to give representation and some autonomy to the Bosniak, Serb, and Croat groups across different areas. Figure 2 in the report actually maps it out. It looks complicated.
I can imagine. And all those layers must mean a ton of different government offices and, well, a lot of public sector employees.
Oh, absolutely. The report points out Bosnia and Herzegovina has a prime minister, and get this, 16 ministries just at the state level.
16, just at the top level.
Yeah. And funding all that, it's a huge undertaking. The money comes from budgets, obviously, but also VAT revenues.
Value-added tax.
Right, collected at a flat 17% rate across the country, then divvied up. Plus excise duties, customs fees, tolls, that kind of thing.
Okay, that 17% VAT rate,
Mm-hmm.
it actually sounds maybe a bit low compared to other places in Europe.
That's a really sharp observation. The report does touch on that. The EU minimum is 15%, right?
Yeah.
But some places, like Hungary, are way up at 27%. So yeah, 17% is relatively low.
And what does that mean practically?
Well, it sort of limits the government's ability to raise revenue for public services compared to, say, its EU neighbors, even though it seems like a lower tax burden initially.
Interesting trade-off. So in actual money terms, how much are we talking about flowing into government funds?
The report gives some numbers. For the first 10 months of 2022, indirect taxes brought in about 8.2 billion KLM.
Okay, billion with a B.
Yeah, which was actually up 19% from 2021. After they give VAT refunds back to businesses, the net amount distributed out to the state, entities, and Brčko was around 6.5 billion KLM.
Okay, 6.5 billion distributed.
Mm-hmm.
How does that break down more locally, like within the Federation?
Table 6 gives a sense of that for Jan Tenov 2022. Sarajevo Canton paid in the most, like 2.15 billion KLM.
Right, the capital region.
Yeah. And Tuzla was next with nearly a billion KLM. It shows where the main economic engines are within the Federation, you know.
Makes sense. And where does all that money go? What about spending?
Well, in the Federation entity for 2022, direct taxes were about 3.2 billion KLM. But what's really striking is how much comes from those indirect taxes. We mentioned VAT and the others.
How much?
About 1.35 billion KLM, which the report says was 80% of the entire Federation budget.
80%. Wow. That really shows how crucial VAT is for funding things.
Hugely reliant on it. And at the state level itself, the report breaks down the 2022 budget too.
Okay.
So you see things like the Parliamentary Assembly getting over 23 million KLM, Ministry of Foreign Affairs over 11 million.
Yeah.
Human Rights and Refugees over 3 million.
Standard ministry costs, sort of.
Yeah, but then there's this really significant chunk for servicing public debt over 819 million KLM.
Oof. That's a lot going just to pay back loans.
It is. And you can see how with these big administrative costs and debt payments, there might be less left over for, say, development projects or social programs.
A real squeeze. Now, the report also brings up something really worrying. people leaving the country.
Yeah, the exodus.
Over 500,000 in the last decade, mostly young people. How does that affect this whole financial picture?
It's a huge threat long-term, a serious threat to the sustainability of the whole public sector.
How so?
Well, you have a shrinking workforce, right?
Yeah.
And a large part of the budget is tied up just running this big administration, funding essential services, ensuring stability. It gets harder and harder.
Fewer working people means a smaller tax base.
Exactly. To support a very large public sector, it's a tough equation.
So what's the way out? Or what does the report suggest to ease this pressure? Any reforms mentioned?
Yes, definitely. It stresses the need for public administration reforms, streamlining things, cutting red tape, and crucially, pushing more e-governance.
Digital government services.
Right. They give some good examples from the EU, like Denmark's basic data program, or the Dutch system with base registries, and the UK's Tell Us Once system.
Tell us once. I like the sound of that. Like, you report a change once, and all departments know.
Precisely. And these things actually save money. The report says e-commerce helped the UK budget by about 10 billion and Denmark by 6.5 billion.
Significant savings.
Huge. Implementing similar digital tools in Bosnia and Herzegovina could boost efficiency, lower costs, and maybe even help formalize parts of the gray economy by making it easier to deal with the state. That could strengthen finances too.
Okay, so streamlining, going digital seems vital. Let's broaden the view now, shift to the overall economy. What are the main challenges and maybe opportunities?
Okay, the report flags 3 key priorities. Keeping things stable economically, macroeconomic stability, making the country more competitive internationally, and just fostering growth overall.
And the numbers. How's the economy actually doing?
Well, there was a strong rebound reported by the World Bank, like 7.4% real GDP growth in 2021.
That sounds good.
Yeah, post-pandemic recovery. The IMF projected slower growth for 2023, around 2.5%.
Okay, still growth, but slower. Any warning signs, though? Vulnerabilities.
There are. The report points to a big jump, 46% in the merchandise trade deficit in the first half of 2023.
Meaning imports way exceeded exports.
Exactly. Likely due to tough global conditions. And that's expected to widen the current account deficit, which tracks all flows in and out.
Not ideal.
No. But on the plus side, foreign direct investment, FDI inflows, were fairly stable in early 2022. Most of it went into the banking sector, which is largely foreign-owned anyway.
Okay, and the overall size of the Bosnian economy?
Yeah.
Growing, shrinking.
It actually dipped slightly in nominal terms from about 36 billion BAM in 2019 to 34 billion.
Right.
But the forecast was for a recovery back up to around 37 billion in 2022. Exports took a hit in 2020, down 8.5%, mostly due to the pandemic's initial shock.
Right, global trade seized up.
Yeah. And the main export category was listed as miscellaneous manufactured articles, so a real mix of finished goods.
Interesting. Now, jobs. Always a crucial sign. What's the employment situation like?
It's mixed. The report shows a pretty low overall employment rate, just 40% for people aged 15-64.
That is low.
And even lower for young people, 15-24, only 35%. But the total number of unemployed people has actually been decreasing, which is positive.
Okay, so fewer officially unemployed. What about wages?
Average net salary in 2022 was 11,156 kilometers.
And the downsides on the jobs front?
Well, the NEET rate young people, not in education, employment, or training, that was high, 22% in 2020. And female employment is particularly low, only 37% in late 2021. Plus, there's this huge chunk of informal employment. Maybe 30% of the workforce is working off the books.
30%.
Yeah. So while official unemployment might be falling, there are these deep structural issues. Youth opportunities, women in the workforce, and this massive informal sector.
A complex picture indeed. Now, Bosnia and Herzegovina got EU candidate status recently, right? December 2022.
That's right. A big milestone.
How does that play into the economy?
Well, it puts more focus on meeting the EU's Copenhagen criteria.
Let me try.
Things like stable democracy, a functioning market economy that can handle EU competition, and being able to actually implement EU rules.
Okay.
But the report also mentions the Heritage Foundation ranks the economy as only moderately free.
Why is that?
Mostly concerns about weak property rights protection and that recurring issue widespread corruption. We'll definitely get back to that.
Keeps coming up. So candidate status is one thing, but there are existing EU agreements too.
Yeah, the Stabilization and Association Agreement, the SAA, that's been fully in place since 2015. Its main goal is gradually creating a free trade zone with the EU.
And the EU is already a big trading partner.
Huge. By far the biggest. Over 60% of imports, almost 3/4 of exports in 2020. And the EU is where about 2/3 of all the foreign investment stock comes from.
So very tightly linked already and set to get closer. Any other international influences?
The report mentions CEFTA, the Central European Free Trade Agreement, helping the regional business climate. And the World Bank has a strategy focusing on government effectiveness, private sector growth, and resilience to disasters.
Sorry.
The country's own development strategy has 6 big goals: stability, competitiveness, sustainability, human capital, good governance, social inclusion. Standard goals, but important.
And institutions like the IMF?
Yep. The IMF provides financial help and advice. And the ILO, the International Labor Organization, works on improving labor standards and conditions. So lots of international actors involved.
Definitely sounds like a lot of external support and engagement. Let's zoom in on one part of that. Foreign direct investment, FDI. What are the trends, the impacts?
Right. So FDI, foreign direct investment. The report defines it clearly. It's investment by a company or person from one country into business interests in another, aiming for a lasting influence or control.
Okay.
Figure 15 shows different types, inward versus outward, obviously, but also horizontal, vertical, conglomerate.
Can you give us quick examples of those last three?
Yes.
Horizontal, vertical, conglomerate.
Sure. Horizontal is like, say, a German car maker opening a factory in Bosnia. Same industry.
Yeah.
Vertical would be if that same car maker bought a Bosnian company that makes, I don't know, car seats for its factory, part of the supply chain.
Right.
And conglomerate is totally unrelated. Maybe a big food company buying a Bosnian IT firm.
Okay, that clarifies it. Thanks. So what are the supposed pros and cons of FDI for a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Figure 16 lays it out. Big potential upsides. New jobs, transfer of knowledge, skills, technology, just boosting the economy generally.
And the downsides.
Potential for exploitation resources, labor, environmental damage if it's not regulated well. The report also mentions multinational corporations, MNCs, as key FDI sources.
Right.
They bring capital and know-how, but also risks like, tax dodging or poor working conditions. So good regulations are key.
Makes sense. Now, specifically for Bosnia and Herzegovina, what makes it potentially attractive for investors?
Several things. Its location is strategic, kind of a bridge between Western and Southeast Europe. It has natural resources, a skilled workforce, relatively speaking, and the investment policies are pretty liberal. They don't usually discriminate against foreign investors. Profits can be taken out.
Sounds promising on paper. But I sense a but coming. What are the big obstacles the report highlights?
The big but is, unfortunately, corruption. Endemic corruption. The report is really clear. It's the single biggest barrier holding back more FDI.
Really undermining the potential.
Massively. It just makes the country seem riskier, less attractive than others nearby. Plus, the slow, complicated red tape for starting a business, getting work permits, that doesn't help either.
It's a recurring theme.
It is. The report even quotes Transparency International, saying there's just not enough political will to fight corruption, and law enforcement seems ineffective.
Depressing. So despite these major hurdles, are any sectors actually attracting investment?
Yes. Thankfully, some sectors are doing okay. The auto industry has history there. VW is present, plus strong local suppliers. Figure 22 shows decent export numbers from 2019.
Okay.
The banking sector, as we said, mostly foreign-owned now. Metals and mining, ArcelorMittal and Zeneca is a hit example. Agriculture has potential, even though they import a lot of food now.
Untapped potential there.
Seems like it. Construction sees international players, especially on big projects. And then there are the emerging creative industries, film, IT, multimedia. Figure 23 highlights those as promising areas.
So pockets of success, despite the broader challenges.
Yeah.
Now let's shift to that hidden part of the economy you mentioned earlier, the gray economy. What is it exactly, and what challenges does it pose?
Right, the gray economy, also called the informal or shadow economy, basically is all the economic activity that goes unreported to the authorities, not counted in official GDP.
Okay.
Figure 25 outlines why people operate there. Sometimes it's just survival, no formal jobs available, poverty. Other times it's avoiding taxes or regulations. Lack of formal opportunities is a big driver.
So it's not just about cheating on taxes.
Tax evasion is definitely part of it and a problem. But the report stresses, for many people and small businesses, especially vulnerable ones, it's often just a practical way to make a living when formal options aren't there.
What are the knock-on effects for the country when this gray economy is really large?
They're pretty bad.
Yep.
Figure 26 compares shadow economies in Europe, and Figure 27 shows Bosnia and Herzegovina's is estimated at nearly double the EU average. Yeah, the consequences. Lost tax revenue, obviously. That means less money for schools, hospitals, roads. It creates unfair competition for businesses playing by the rules.
Right. They're at a disadvantage.
Totally. And ultimately, it just hinders overall economic and social development. It erodes trust in the system, too.
Has it always been this big? What's the history?
Well, right after the war in 1998, estimates were huge, like 43% of GDP.
Wow.
A 2018 USA study put it around a third of GDP, maybe varying a bit between the entities. Interestingly, introducing VAT back in 2006 is thought to have helped shrink it somewhat.
How so?
Gave businesses more incentive to register formally so they could claim back VAT they paid on their own purchases.
Okay. So some progress, but it's still a massive issue today.
Seems so. Still estimated at up to a third of GDP. Still hitting competition, still shrinking the tax base. Transparency International links this environment to weak rule of law, making it easier for the gray economy to flourish.
And the scale in money terms.
The ILO projected it at about 33% of GDP in purchasing power terms, which works out to around $18 billion.
$18 billion, that's huge. And what about people working informally?
Also very high. The ILO said in 2021 about 14% of all employed people were in informal jobs. Figure 29 breaks that down. Table 16 looks at it by gender. And COVID, figure 31 shows, likely pushed more people into informal work as formal jobs disappeared.
14% of workers. That's a lot of people without formal contracts, protections.
Exactly. No safety net. Beyond the domestic impact, does this big gray economy affect international relations?
That's a good question. The report says yes. It can put off international businesses looking for reliable, transparent partners.
Makes sense.
And it definitely complicates things with the EU. They want economic reform, rule of law, transparency. A huge gray economy doesn't fit that picture. Plus, it can fuel cross-border issues, smuggling, illegal trade, straining relations with neighbors. So it's an internal problem with external consequences. What's being done legally or institutionally to fight it?
The report outlines the usual approaches. Stimulative measures trying to make it easier and more attractive to go formal, like cutting red tape, maybe tax breaks.
The carrot approach.
Right. Then control measures, beefing up tax inspectors using digital tracking, and punitive measures, bigger fines, penalties, maybe publicizing legal actions.
The stick.
Exactly. There's a law on fiscal systems mandating cash registers, basically, to track sales, and recent or draft laws on things like internal trade, real estate agents, accounting. They're partly aimed at closing loopholes for the gray economy.
So a mix of things. What's the report's main takeaway on how to really tackle this?
It really emphasizes that just punishing people isn't enough. You need a deep understanding of why it's happening.
Right.
Policies need to be smart, refining regulations so they're not impossible for small businesses, creating a fair tax system, and making state institutions work better and more honestly. The ILO definition itself points out the informal sector often covers activities not properly handled by formal systems anyway.
So it needs integrated strategies. Not just punishment, but making formalization easier and worthwhile.
Exactly. A path towards formality plus social protections.
Okay, let's pull back again, look at the really big picture. Bosnia and Herzegovina and the International Political Economy, or IPE. What exactly is IPE?
Right, IPE. Figures 32 and 33 explain it. It's basically a field that looks at how politics and economics interact on the world stage. It's multidisciplinary, uses ideas from international relations, economics, politics, sociology.
To get a fuller picture.
Precisely. So for Bosnia and Herzegovina, analyzing its IPE helps us understand how political factors, domestic and international, really shape its economy.
So looking back at the early post-war period, what defined its IPE then?
Well, the sheer scale of destruction was overwhelming. The report estimates $30 to $45 billion in damage.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, the worst in Europe since WWII. That obviously shaped everything. And then that decentralized political structure from Dayton played a huge role in things like privatization and attracting FDI.
Oh.
Privatization was handled mostly at the entity level, even cantonal in the Federation. That often meant less transparency, more chance for political influence, you know.
Right.
And FDI rules were also mostly set by the entities, sometimes leading to them competing against each other in unhelpful ways, creating a fragmented landscape for investors.
So that decentralization, meant to solve political issues, created economic hurdles.
In some ways, yes. It added layers of complexity and potential inefficiency, and other political factors continue to heavily influence the economy.
Like what?
Well, the complex governance we already talked about leads to really high public spending. The IMF noted in 2020 it has one of Europe's biggest public sectors relative to its economy size.
Why?
Then there's the widespread corruption we keep mentioning, erodes trust, distorts decisions, scares off investment, and just general political instability.
From ethnic disputes, deadlocks.
Yeah, disputes, the presidency getting deadlocked, that delays reforms, even basic things like budget approvals. Figure 34 shows its transformation index score. Figure 35 highlights the doing business challenges like starting a business. Politics plays into all that.
And the EU's influence, how does that fit in?
The report sees it as both an opportunity and a challenge.
Oh.
Opportunity for economic benefits, stability. Challenge because meeting EU requirements needs tough reforms, and there's often domestic political resistance to those changes. Foreign relations and aid have also been crucial, the report notes, for financial stability and rebuilding infrastructure.
The report also mentions democratization after the war. How did that interact with the political economy?
International actors were heavily involved in pushing democratization, but establishing a really functional democracy has hit roadblocks.
Like what?
Resistance from, let's say, anti-democratic forces,
Oh.
weak state institutions. The Venice Commission criticized the Constitution for lacking citizen input in its adoption. And Freedom House sees the governance as only nominally democratic, often undermined by ethno-nationalist politicians blocking progress. The decision-making setup itself is often inefficient, needing reform.
And this idea of partocracy.
Yeah, where political parties basically control institutions, filling jobs with loyalists who aren't always competent. That hinders building strong institutions and the rule of law.
So political factors are just deeply tangled with the economy, often holding it back. What's the main message here?
That deep corruption and nepotism are huge drags on economic development. That cantonal autonomy, while serving a purpose, can create policy patchwork that complicates business. And ultimately, while international help is important, the country's progress really depends on its own domestic political choices and a real commitment to reform from its leaders.
Which brings us inevitably back to corruption.
Yes.
It's clearly a massive thread running through everything. The report gives it a whole chapter.
It really does, and it identifies corruption as a major, complex problem. It breaks down the different types, too. Grand corruption, the big stuff. High-level officials, petty corruption, everyday bribes for services, institutionalized corruption baked into the system, operational specific acts, even noble cause corruption, state capture, where private interests basically take over state policy for their own benefit. Bureaucratic corruption, political corruption, and bribery is singled out as especially common in Bosnia.
The report also talks about fraud.
Right.
Using some specific model.
Yeah, it brings in things like the fraud triangle, pressure, opportunity, rationalization.
The three things needed for fraud.
Kind of the classic model. Then the fraud diamond adds capability, the skills to pull it off. And the fraud pentagon adds ego or entitlement. Figures 44 and 45 show these. It also mentions classifying fraud by who the victim is, and Table 17 gives a whole list of fraud types.
And besides bribery and fraud, it looks at favoritism, nepotism, cronyism. Things people often feel are corrupt, even without cash changing hands.
Absolutely. Nepotism favoring relatives. Cronyism favoring friends. The report lists signs you might see this happening. It also mentions research categorizing it for their partisanship, clientelism, service favoritism.
So favoritism in jobs, in services.
Exactly. Different facets of giving unfair advantages based on connections, not merit.
So how does Bosnia and Herzegovina actually measure up on corruption internationally? What does the data say?
Not great, unfortunately. The report uses the Corruption Perception Index, the CPI. In 2020, Bosnia and Herzegovina ranked 111th out of 180 countries. Its score was 35 out of 100, the lowest it had been since 2016.
Ouch. Low score, low rank.
Yeah. Tables 18 to 22 and figures 46, 47 show the details. And a PwC survey found 47% of businesses there experienced fraud in 2020. World Bank data, figure 51, also shows perceived favoritism among officials is high. It paints a pretty bleak picture.
47% experiencing fraud. It's nearly half. So what are the overall consequences of all this corruption?
They're huge and damaging, economically. Lower growth, bigger deficits, less FDI, more inequality. It pushes people to emigrate, especially skilled ones, wastes resources, undermines social programs, stifles innovation.
Basically touches everything negatively.
Pretty much. And beyond money, fraud has non-financial costs too. Stress, health issues for victims, damage to organizations, market distortions, even national security risks. Favoritism is particularly bad for development because you get unqualified people in charge, it kills competition, lowers morale.
Just corrosive all around. Now, the report did its own research, too. Interviews.
Yes, qualitative research. They did direct, standardized interviews with various people to get their perspectives. They used secondary data, too, from reports and so on, to shape the questions. About 30 questions grouped into themes.
What came out of those interviews? What did people on the ground say?
Well, there was a strong feeling that corruption is widespread, maybe even increasing.
And what do they see as the causes?
Weak rule of law, lack of accountability were big ones. Low salaries in the public sector were mentioned as maybe creating incentives. Even public opinion, a sort of tolerance for it sometimes.
And the worst forms, in their view.
Fraud, favoritism, bribery came up most often as the really damaging ones. People talked about how it scares off investors, makes tax evasion easier, hits living standards, increases poverty.
Any personal stories?
Yeah, some mentioned being asked for bribes for medical care or at customs. Very real-world impacts.
Definitely brings it home. Did they connect corruption directly to broader economic problems?
Oh, yes. They saw it causing stagnation, lowering GDP, said it hurts international development efforts by making government less efficient, investments less effective. The link between nepotism in public hiring and high unemployment came up a lot.
And grain drain.
Absolutely. Seen as a major cause. Talented people leave because they feel opportunities aren't fair, the system's unjust. They also talked about misuse of public funds, lack of budget transparency.
And how does it affect businesses or organizations internally?
Lowers motivation, obviously. Hiring unqualified people hurts performance, creates distrust. It also messes up market competition. Insiders with information or who pay bribes get ahead. Fair players lose out.
A really dysfunctional environment. Did people feel they could report corruption?
That was a big issue, fear of retaliation because whistleblower protection is seen as weak, and a general lack of trust in the institutions that are supposed to handle it.
Makes it very hard to tackle.
Very. But they did offer suggestions. More individual accountability, strengthening the rule of law, the courts, making institutions work better, more transparently, and raising public awareness about how damaging it all is.
So wrapping this all up, it's a really complex web of interconnected challenges we've explored in this deep dive based on this report.
Yeah, definitely. You've got this complex, expensive administration, an economy that's recovering but still fragile, corruption acting as a major brake on investment, this huge gray economy operating alongside the formal one, the complicated international political context and corruption woven through almost all of it.
And it's so clear they're not separate issues you can fix one by one.
Exactly. They feed into each other. It demands a really comprehensive, sustained effort, politically, socially, to make real headway.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. Considering how deeply embedded these challenges are, the administration, the economy, the corruption, the politics, what kind of really fundamental shifts, maybe in governance, maybe even in societal values, might actually be needed for Bosnia and Herzegovina to truly unlock all that potential we know it has and secure a more prosperous, stable future?
Definitely something to think about.